Morning, Mr. Commissioner. Brian Wallace, Commission Counsel, and Lara Tesoro is with me. By my reckoning, we have another 30 minutes from Mr. Harvey, followed by Ms. Gertner with a 60-minute estimate. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Commissioner, Chris Harvey for the Area G and UFAWU. Dr. McFarland, you mentioned yesterday that the trophic level in the Strait of Georgia was diminished in 2007, I think was the year reference you gave. Is that part of a declining trend?
No, yes, I did mention 2007 as the year in question,
yes,
because 2007, of course, is the ocean entry year of the 2009 return year. However, 2007 is the low point of the years just prior to it, the few years that I looked at, and the 2008 and 2009 ocean entry years were both much better. So 2007 was definitely lower. Is it part of a trend in terms of all those species? I would suggest not. Herring did very well in many years up until the early 2000s. Chum and pink are doing well.
But so you have some means of measuring the trophic level in the Strait of Georgia, do you?
Well, yes, but what I was referring to was the condition factor of the fish, the smolts of the 5 salmon species, and of the young of the year herring. So that when you measure condition, you're measuring their ability to how they responded to the food sources available to them at the time.
But when you're measuring salmon smolts, you no doubt have difficulty distinguishing between freshwater trophic impacts and saltwater trophic impacts. Would I be correct? Because the salmon are recently emerging from fresh water by the time you see them in the Strait of Georgia.
Correct.
Yes. So if you see them fat one year and skinny the next year, it may be due to freshwater, or it may be due to their first week or so in saltwater.
That's probably a fair statement,
yes,
but I don't look at freshwater. I would put that question to the freshwater people. But certainly herring don't go into freshwater.
No.
Other species I look at in other areas don't go into freshwater.
Yes.
So it's a pretty reliable indicator, yes, of the first few weeks in saltwater.
Yes. But insofar as you rely on herring abundance, of course, changes from year to year quite dramatically too, does it not?
Sure, everything changes dramatically from year to year, but you look at overall abundance of all those species in concert, and you look at condition factor of specific species in a specific year, and you can then from that make some observations on what you believe, yes, they're responding to.
Yes. So you believe there's an upward trend from 2007 through 2008, 2009, and 2010?
An upward trend in condition factor?
Yes, trophic level of the Strait of Georgia.
No, that's not what I said. I said that the condition factor of the smolts in the years following 2007 was better.
Oh, I see. But can you give us any indication of the trophic level in the Strait of Georgia in terms of trends?
Sorry, I can. What trophic level would you like?
Well,
Do you mean the primary levels of food production?
Yes.
Yes, that is available through other people's work who study the lower trophic level, which is basically the copepod euphosid biomasses.
Yes. And how is it trending?
How is it?
What does a trend line look like?
I don't know. I haven't looked at the recent years. It was certain. My understanding is certainly the physics of the strait changed or was different in early 2007. The physics is usually related to the productivity, the timing of the spring bloom. So I suspect that's where the connection is right now.
Mr. Commissioner, there is a whole topic on marine habitat conditions which will come up later in the hearing schedule.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Hume, following a question yesterday from the Commissioner, you gave a description of how the fry move emerging from the gravel along the shores of the lake out into the deep water in the summer. What happens in the fall and through the following winter?
Most of the fry are out in deep water for that stage of their life. Again, they spend the daytime down in deep and quite deep down in say in Quesnel Lake, down 70, 80 meters of water.
Yes.
And they'll come up towards the surface as it gets dark to feed.
Do they continue feeding through the winter?
Feeding rates are certainly very much lower. They probably don't feed all that much throughout the winter, no.
But it's not.
Again, it depends on the lake, your system you're talking about. In the interior lakes like Quesnel, Shuswap, there probably is very little feeding going on in the winter, whereas coastal lakes, Harrison, Pitt, Caltus,
Yes.
there's still production going on.
So in the Quesnel, for example, is it similar to a form of hibernation, like the bears go through in the wintertime?
No, it's not hibernation. It's more the fish are just dormant, I guess. The water's cold. Their metabolism is slower. It's slowed down.
And when do they go into that dormant phase?
I can't really say. I believe that there's anything less than about 5 degrees centigrade, the fish tend not to be very active.
Do they rely on their fat or energy reserves that they've accumulated during the summer to get them through the winter?
That would certainly be a major portion of their metabolic usage, yes.
Yes. The graphs we looked at yesterday with the, perhaps we could bring it up again at tab 11, the difference in the dominant and the subdominant cycles for various years. And I recognize that you're not comfortable with this because you didn't plot the numbers and haven't checked them. But assuming they're correct, the top graph seems to show that the Daphnia biomass is depleted shortly after the fall equinox.
The final samples in that would be October, actually. Is the final data points.
Early October?
Yeah, early to mid-October.
Yes. The fry would still be feeding at that time, though.
They would still be feeding. Water temperatures would still be around 10 degrees or so.
That is, if there's any food around to feed on, of course.
Yes, Daphnia are not the only food that it's their preferred prey item, but they also will feed on other
Yes.
planktons that are in the water column at the time. So
The other graph you gave yesterday showed a leveling off of the. I'm sorry.
Just for the record, Mr. Commissioner, this is Exhibit 814.
Thank you. The other graph you showed yesterday, going from recollection, but it may have been 804, but it showed a sort of a leveling off of a leveling off phenomenon. And I think you've studied that, and in a moment I'm going to take you to your 1996 paper, but you've determined that there is a leveling off that occurs in a number of different lakes. Is that correct? In fry numbers? Or
that's
what?
correct. There appears to be a maximum abundance of fry that the lake can support, or will support.
No, a leveling off like that would have to be caused by available food supply, would it not? Because predators wouldn't be able to affect a leveling off of that nature, would they, in any population?
Presumably, the smaller fry are weakened by lack of food and the dying off for whatever reason. Presumably, more susceptible. One reason would be a major reason would be more susceptible to predation.
Yes. Dr. Christensen, do you have a comment on that phenomenon?
Predators can impact the situation. The curve you showed us yesterday indicates a Barrow's and Holt curve, and there are, when you get over a certain number of spawners, you don't see any more recruits.
Yes.
Now, the reason for that can be a question of food supply, but it can also be that there is a certain number of places where the smolts can hide, and those that are not able to be in these optimal places are more susceptible to predation.
Yes.
So it can be a combination. Very often these things are a combination of
Yes.
predators and food.
Yes.
But certainly it indicates a carrying capacity
Yes. All right.
that is being exceeded with high spawning stocks.
And by carrying capacity, well, I see. By carrying capacity, you have to take into account both. But Mr. Hume, you've determined that there is definitely a certain carrying capacity in Quesnel and certain other lakes.
That's correct.
That's correct. Insofar as that is determined by food supply, all the young fry would be equally affected by the lack of food, correct?
Yes. In the case of sockeye fry, as Dr. Christensen said, the fry are, and what the fry are probably is happening is that they're actually feeding more. They're not getting enough food, and so they actually spend more time feeding up in the upper water column where they are more vulnerable to
Yes.
to predation.
Yes. And they'd also be more vulnerable to warm water cause mortality in the upper levels of the lakes, wouldn't they?
During the peak of the summer, that's a problem in
Yes.
some lakes, yes.
I accept that what you say about there being two causes, and that's abundantly plain. But insofar as you determined, for example, in the 2002 brood year in the Quesnel, the smolts were a smaller size, a record small size.
That's right.
That would indicate that the lack of food is having a significant effect.
Yes, it would.
Yes, all right. And in any population, where a population is controlled by lack of food, some people will die of, whether it's humans or animals, will die of starvation. Others will cope with that starvation, but will be less robust and less fat. Correct?
Yes, that'd be correct.
This paper has been often cited. I've noticed it's still valid generally in its conclusions. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it is.
At page 720, that's 002 on the ringtail numbers.
I believe that's Exhibit 575.
Oh, yes, thank you, it is, 575. There's a chart B for Quesnel Lake that shows the escapement increases in recent years.
Wow.
And on the in the right-hand column near the top, it's a passage I'd like to read and then ask you about, starting 4 lines down. During the rebuilding period, when escapements were relatively low, rearing capacity in the lakes was not a concern. Rather, optimum escapement estimates were based on estimates of spawning ground capacity. Since 1980s in the Shuswap and Quesnel lakes, in 1990 in Chilco, dominant and subdominant brood year returns and escapements have been very high. You mentioned that figure 1, the 1958 return to Shuswap was also high, but subsequent returns dropped considerably and have been building ever since. Determination of escapement levels that will maximize subsequent adult returns is now crucial to the efficient management of Fraser sockeye stocks. Escapement lower than the optimum will result in reduced adult returns. Any brood year escapements higher than the optimum entail foregoing harvestable sockeye and will produce at best no increases in harvestable sockeye in subsequent brood years. if high escapements result in excessive fry recruitment, and if the high escapements are consecutive, substantial and long-term declines in total stock size may occur, resulting in considerable economic loss. Since the mid-1980s, we have been conducting studies on these 3 lakes. Our studies are the first that have included detailed investigations of every major lake trophic level, from microbial community to planktivorous fish, as well as measurements of salient physical and chemical variables. This ecosystem approach has enabled us to produce the first estimates of optimum spawning escapements based on a lake's productivity and its ability to rear juvenile sockeye. Now, first, I wanted to ask Dr. Christensen whether that is an example of an ecosystem-based approach, because in the sense that it takes into account not just the sockeye, but the carrying capacity, and in other words, the other ecosystem creatures, and also takes into account socioeconomic matters.
Yes, that's a fair statement
Yes.
that you made.
Mr. Hume, you said yesterday in answer to a question that Mr. Timberg put to you that your research data has been incorporated into forecasting models. Do you mean forecasts of run size?
Yes, I do.
All right. Do you know if your carrying capacity data has been incorporated into the setting of upper benchmarks in the FRISI model?
I haven't been involved with the FRISI model at all myself,
All right.
but it has been incorporated into the recent stock status report for CSAS just last year.
Oh, yes. Before that, was there any similar program or study or model that incorporated your carrying capacity data into escapement?
Not that I'm aware of.
Page 007 of this report, towards the bottom, just the bottom right-hand column, there's just the last 2 lines, and then I'll go over to the next page. It reads that escapements, this is, of course, in this paper you study the Shuswap, the Quesnel, and the Chilko Lake, is that correct?
That's correct.
You say escapements greater than 25 effective female spawners per hectare, total adult escapements of 1.5 million, to Shuswap Lake. So we have to go down to the bottom, Mr. Lund, of the left-hand column there to pick up the text. The Shuswap Lake did not produce any more fall fry, peaking at 4,900 fry per hectare. Similarly, escapements to Quesnel Lake of 15 effective female spawners per hectare, total adult escapements of 0.8 million, also did not produce any more fry, peaking at 2,600 fry per hectare. Those you give both the effective female spawners and total adult escapement. So the Quesnel Lake figure for total adult escapement is 0.8 million or 800,000. Is that? Am I interpreting this correctly?
That's right, yes.
In the right-hand column on the same page, there's reference to an Alaskan study. Go down just before the heading. Yes, and then Alaska is mentioned. Yes, right there. Those 8 or so lines at the bottom of that long paragraph. In Leisure Lake, it says a much smaller lake in Alaska. Konings and Burkett found that smolt numbers did not increase after spring fry numbers exceeded 10,000 per hectare at densities greater than 10,000 fry per hectare. Smolt numbers did not increase further, with smolt numbers declining at the highest fry densities. These results are very similar to the curvilinear relationship we found between EFS and subsequent summer and fall fry numbers, Shuswap and Quesnel lakes. So you mentioned an Alaska study. There has been some good work done in Alaska, and you found that reliable, Mr. Hume, so far as?
How do you mean reliable? I mean,
Well, you haven't any reason to say that they've misapplied their.
not for the lakes that they were working on, no.
Yes, all right. Right, in the next paragraph, under juvenile sockeye size, you're discussing summer fry size in Quesnel and Shuswap lakes did not vary with spawner density, etc. And then you drop in the next, and then it says fall fry. I'm beginning the next paragraph. Fall fry and smolt size in all 3 lakes declined rapidly as effective female spawner density increased to about 10 EFS per hectare. At escapements greater than 10 EFS per hectare, fall fry size did not significantly decline in either Shuswap or Quesnel lakes. So, am I interpreting this correctly, that there's a decrease in size in fall fry at levels greater than, or actually, why don't you interpret that for me? It seems at some point you have a decrease and then you have no more decrease.
The initial decrease in growth is very rapid as density increases, but it levels off at higher densities, is basically all we're saying.
All right. So at low densities, you'll get a large size smolt as the escapement or spawning density increases, the size reduces and then levels off.
Well, it's a curve. It's curvilinear, but but yes.
Yeah, I see. And that would be, of course, reducing in size because of a lack of food.
A decrease in food, yes.
Yes. Predators wouldn't have any effect in that, or any significant effect in that.
Predators may have maybe part of the reason why this mean size levels off at higher densities, because the smaller fry would be more susceptible to predation.
At tab 6, there I have Exhibit 399.
Mr. Harvey, what are some of the time frames here? In chief, Dr. Hume mentioned that his work was incorporated into forecasting models, but really didn't give any details around that.
Yes.
And then you've just raised that with him based on Exhibit 575, but I don't have any time frame sense here. In other words, over what period of time was his work incorporated into the forecasting models? Is that still the case, or was it just the case at the time that this study that you referred him to around that time? I just have no sense of time frame.
Yes, that's useful. Mr. Hume, there are 2 things. Your work, to your knowledge, has been utilized for the purpose of forecasting run size. That's returning run size.
Yes.
Over what time periods are you aware that that's been used?
Almost from for Quesnel and Shuswap Lake, we have data going back to 1975, and the time when I joined the department in 1987, the forecast, the relationship between fall fry and returning adults was being used as one of the forecast elements.
Yes.
And it continues to this day to be one of the items that they ask for in conducting their forecasts.
Yes. So they basically ask you for the numbers of fall fry, and then they use that in their forecasts.
That's correct.
And that's been ongoing, as you say, for a number of years.
We usually only do collect our data for the dominant and subdominant runs into the 2 lakes, and so it's used in those 2 years, but not in the other non-dominant years.
And then the other matter you discussed was the use of your data in terms of escapement determinations or benchmarks. And to your knowledge, your data has only been used very recently for that purpose. Is that
That's
correct?
correct. That was based on our lower trophic level primary production model.
Yes.
And,
And by very recently, in the last year, do you mean, or what?
well, for the Fraser River, yes, just the last year.
All right.
But in other systems within the province, it's been used since early 2000s.
Page 99 of tab 6, this is Exhibit 399, Pestle and Cast 2010. Page 99 has the Quesnel numbers. If we look at the 2001 near the bottom, just the last decade, interested in. 2001, the escapement, total escapement in the Quesnel system was 3,510,000 odd, according to this. That compares with your optimum escapement estimate that you mentioned a moment ago of 800,000. Is that correct?
Yes.
So it would well, I'll leave that comment for argument. And that would be certainly significantly beyond the carrying capacity of the lake as you estimated it, correct?
That's correct.
And then the same happened.
I would say I would prefer to call it the optimum capacity of the lake to produce smolts.
Optimum capacity, yes. Thank you. In 2002, well, dealing in 2001, if we look at the results of that, the total recruits, which is mostly 4 years and some 5 years later, but straight across in the right-hand column, 3,700,000. So that's, as you would expect, a very low productivity level, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by.
Yes, all right. Well,
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's approximately one-to-one relationship. Yes.
Now, 2002, again, there was an escapement, this time 3,062,151, escapement that's significantly over your optimum carrying capacity level.
That's correct.
Correct. And this time the recruits are much reduced, 640,000.
Yes.
So it looks as though there's a carryover effect of some sort going on here. In other words, or do these numbers tell us that what's likely happened is that the the Daphne and the other food web sources for the sockeye fry from the 2001 brood year were seriously depleted, and there was some carryover of that depletion in the following year?
That's certainly the freshwater conditions were one of the components of this. The fall fry were the smallest we'd observed that year.
Yes.
And we did some subsequent smolt sampling as well, and there showed no indication of overwinter growth in that year as well.
Yes.
Overwinter and early spring growth.
Yes. The 2002 brood year, I think, is the year you found that record low 1.9 gram
That's correct,
fry
yes.
size. But Dr. McFarlane, is there anything happening in the Strait of Georgia that might have accounted or contributed to the low recruitment from the 2002 brood year? That would be 2004 conditions in the Strait of Georgia, I think.
2004, there was a flip cooler temperatures to slightly warmer temperatures coast-wide, which lasted for a couple of years, 3 years actually. So you could say that, off the top of my head, I could say that there was indications of some change in the physical environment, but I haven't looked in detail at the biological thing relating to that particular species.
And I'm sorry, I forgot that I was reminded by Mr. Wallace that that's coming later. At any rate, yes, let me move on. if I may.
Mr. Harvey, my clock says you're at the end of your time. How are you doing?
Well, unfortunately, I've got a little bit to go, and I do consider it quite important. I mean, we are really trying to solve the mystery on the Orient Express, and it's hard to do that in the space of mystery of the murder on the Orient Express. It's hard to do that in the space of this time. Would I be permitted to have another 20 minutes?
That's problematic, Mr. Harvey. Can you've run more than an hour now.
Well, in that case, could I just close then by marking some exhibits?
Just, Mr.
Sorry.
Wallace, we could just check with other council to see whether we can give Mr. Harvey another 15 minutes here.
Ms. Gertner is going to use her time, as I understand it, for this panel, but may have less for Squid. So perhaps, Mr. Harvey, if you could try and wrap up in 5-7 minutes, something
Yes.
like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The tab 1 of the documents that I submitted is Exhibit 726. This is the Koenigs and Kyle paper in Alaska. I just wanted to either agree, and perhaps you've already done this, that this is a well-regarded paper in this field. Is that correct?
Sorry.
Mr. Hume?
Yes, it's certainly known, yes.
At tab 4, a paper co-authored by yourself, Mr. Hume, James Woody, and Michael Lapointe. This is a paper that you participated in. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The abstract makes note of examinations of interactions among cycle lines, sockeye foraging appears responsible, etc., etc. Are these findings still valid, in your opinion?
Yes, they are.
I wonder if that could be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 815.
Tab 5 is Exhibit 576. This is a paper that I think we have to, yes, have to turn over to the next page. Yes, paper co-authored by you, John Stockner and Ken Shortreed, is that right?
That's right.
Still valid as far as you're aware?
Yes, it is.
Okay. We, Exhibit 802 we looked at earlier. This is your paper on, paper you co-authored on predation by rainbow trout. You found that the rainbow trout in some of these studies had 95% sockeye fry in their stomach.
Yes, we did.
So rainbow trout are a significant predator of sockeye fry, obviously.
Yes, depending on their abundance, which
Yeah.
we didn't measure.
Yes. At tab 10 is a 2011 paper by a German scientist by the name of Guel, English person by the name of Drossel, and certain others. You're familiar with this paper?
I've skimmed through the paper, yes.
And the authors set out to compare the population dynamics for sockeye fry in British Columbia, in the Fraser. Sockeye fry, their predators, and their zooplankton food. Is that right?
Sorry, what was the question?
Well, as the title indicates, a three-species model explaining cyclic dominance of Pacific salmon. The three species that are studied are sockeye fry, the predators of the fry, and the zooplankton, I think. Is that right?
Well, they didn't actually study any of them, but they use those as explanatory variables in their model.
Yes. And they based a lot of their work on your data, I think. Is that correct?
I don't believe they actually use any of my data in their paper.
All right. But at any rate, is this, I don't know if Dr. Christensen has a chance to read this, is this an example of an ecosystem-based approach in that not only the sockeye fry are being looked at, but their predators and the food web?
It's ecosystem analysis light, I would call it. So considering a small part of the ecosystem.
Yes, all right. Are any of you aware of anything similar that's been done by DFO or been done by British Columbia scientists? I'm just curious as to why it takes a German and an English scientist to put this together.
Well, first of all, the last author on this paper is a DFO scientist.
Oh, yes.
And certainly we've been looking at cyclic dominance work for a number of years.
Yeah, but I think the funding for this came from overseas, did it not?
Yes, I don't expect there was a lot of expenses involved with this paper.
All right. Could that be marked, please, as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 816.
Yeah, I think I've probably exhausted my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey.
Thank
Ms.
you very
Gardner?
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Brenda Gartner for the First Nations Coalition, and with me, Crystal Reeves. I'm going to take the time this morning. I have an hour allotted to me. I want to do a number of things. First, I want to do some clarifications on the reports and use the report. I'm going to have to ask Mr. Hume a couple of clarifying questions, given the work of Mr. Harvey. And then I want to use the time to use the report, Mr. Commissioner, as a springboard to having a fairly a broader level discussion on ecosystem-based management. You'll recall at the beginning of this inquiry that we had Dr. David Close and Dr. Reynolds come and give you some definitional introductions to this notion of ecosystem-based management. And in my experience and my clients' experience, it's a word that's often used but difficult to implement. And so I want to use this panel, which includes an expert, an academic, and some practitioners, to explore some of the challenges associated with operationalizing ecosystem-based management. And so I'm going to use the report as a lifting off place more than a drilling down place. And I have some documents to help us in that work, and that'll help the panel get a sense of where I'm going to go. And I apologize, I wasn't able to speak to the panel or all of the panel ahead of time, so I just want to let you know who I'm representing. First Nations Fisheries Council, which is a provincial organization some of you will be familiar with. And then from the perspective of the First Nations, my client base includes the Haida, 3 of the Saanich First Nations. So the Strait of Georgia is, of course, an important component of their territory. And then the tribes on the Fraser, beginning in Chehalis and then going all the way up to the headwaters of the Fraser. And so the lakes that you've spent a lot of time with, Mr. Hume, sit in the heart of some of those territories. And I'm going to begin by asking a general question. We posed it for the earlier panel on marine mammals, and I would like to have your expertise on this. At page 11 of the report, and I don't think I need to take you there, but you can go there if you want, There's a statement that says if warmer climate conditions did lead to talks about the impact of warmer climate conditions. You'll see it at the paragraph just above the title, Predator Satiation and Depensation. Another aspect of environmental conditions relates to the impact of water temperatures. And then the last sentence is, this is illustrated by Peterson and Kitchell, who used oceanic, coastal, and freshwater climate indices and simulations of bioenergetics of key predators, and predicted that warmer climatic conditions can lead to an increase in predation rates in the range of 26 to 31%. If warmer climate conditions did lead to an increase in predator rates in the range of 26 to 31%, which of the predators considered, and those that you have expertise with, could become immediate or significant concerns to the long-term sustainability of the Fraser River sockeye salmon? And in addition to the predators, I'd also like you to comment on competitors. I think that's an extremely important component of climate change. And I'll begin with you, Dr. Christensen, and then turn to you, Dr. McFarland, and then Mr. Hume.
We would expect that that the impact of climate change would be most pronounced in freshwater and in coastal waters. So you would look for those predators as being the key predators with regards to climate change. The river especially.
That pretty well takes the full migration route of the Fraser River sockeye salmon.
I didn't mention the open ocean.
Oh,
but the migration route,
coastal,
well, they continue migrations out there in a big circle. So it's especially in freshwater and in coastal waters you would see this effect.
All right. Maybe I'll just go to each of the DFO experts who have expertise in both of those. Dr. McFarland, can we start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Hume.
I suspect that the first place I think would be worth looking would be at the large migratory pelagics. Warmer waters generally indicate a change in distribution. In many of these species, both distribution in terms of oceanic to more coastal waters and in southern predators in a northward movement pattern. Things like hake, some of the shark species, those would be where I would consider the places to look. Now, having said that, I don't believe that those particular aspects of the whole system are controlling what is happening with these species, prey species.
Sorry, I don't believe they're controlling? Sorry.
I don't believe that this is a result of top-down forcing of predator control on any of the species, let alone Fraser River sockeye. I haven't seen information that would lead me to indicate, or that would indicate to me that any of these predators would selectively choose a specific stock of fish or stocks of fish to and above all others. Biologically and ecologically, to me, it does not make sense.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Mr. Hume?
It's very difficult to choose one or two or any to determine which predators would be affected by warmer climate increases. Again, as Dr. McFarland said, I would probably look at some of the bigger predators, such as the rainbow trout and pike minnow. But it's quite possible that near-shore predators such as sculpins may have a major effect as well. But I really can't comment on what the effects would be.
So it's fair to say that although we're beginning to identify warming climate changes, that the science is at its infancy in understanding what implications that will have for the Fraser River sockeye salmon, and that we're going to have to develop models and look very closely as these climatic changes begin to show up more clearly.
I think that'd be a reasonable statement.
Ms. McFarland?
Yeah, as far as that goes, that's a reasonable statement. I think what you need, it's always nice to develop models, but you might want to actually have some data to put into them. So you want to ensure that you're directing some targeted programs at the issues that you think, or the timeframes that you think may be most appropriate.
Okay, we're going to get to the relationship between data and models in quite a bit. So let's, Dr. Christensen.
Just that it's probably fair to say we have quite limited experience with regards to the Fraser River. But overall, in the scientific community, there's a lot of work being aimed at developing models with the underlying data to predict the impact of climate change. But it's at a broader scale, it's not at the scale of the Fraser River. And that is really very intensive research going on there. So lots of things are happening there. But you also asked the question of alternative prey, of prey, the implications of prey. And one aspect that we have not even talked about in this hearing, this panel, has been the potential that there might be alternative prey. And what happens to the alternative prey. Is that where you wanted to go?
Yes, you can go there.
If we look at the amount of Fraser River when they're out in the ocean, we may be talking of something of the order of depending on the years, anywhere from, say, 20 to 60,000 tons of prey. If we look at what else is out in the ocean and how the biomasses of those other potential prey have changed in recent years, we've seen stocks that are measured more with 1 million ton disappearing. So much larger amounts of alternative prey has disappeared. And that's one area where predators may have an increasing impact on the sockeye because of the lack of the alternative prey. I think I made a really bad explanation of that.
Do you want to sum it up?
Sum it up. There's a certain amount of prey out there. If we're losing, say, half of that prey, then the half that's left, which includes the sockeye, may be subject to much more intense predation pressure. We have probably not seen that the number of predators have decreased significantly, but what they can eat have likely decreased in the North Pacific in the last 10, 15 years.
So if I understand that correctly, it may be that the sockeye salmon will become much more important in other animals' diets in the ocean conditions as ocean conditions change. Have I heard that right?
If we look back, I think this may have happened. What will happen in the future, we still need to better numbers for that.
Okay, I want to turn, Mr. Hume, I've got a couple of very short questions arising from the discussions we've had about optimum capacities, and I want to take you to Exhibit 399 for a moment. Sorry, Mr. Lunn, I hadn't warned you on that. And in particular, the questions that have been asked around the 2 years in which there was a higher return to the Quesnel River, or Quesnel Lake, sorry, in 2001 and 2002. If I got the exhibit wrong, sorry, it's the, what page are the? 99. Page 99, thank you. All 2001 and 2002, Mr. Hume?
I'm getting on in years.
I know that's sometimes difficult, but perhaps I'll refresh your memory. Do you recall that in those years we were struggling on the Fraser with understanding what was happening with the late runs, and in particular the late runs that co-migrate at the time with the Quesnel runs there?
I have some recollection of that.
And if you'll recall, that we weren't planning to have an escapement of over 3 million into the Quesnel that year, were we?
I don't believe so, but I can't really speak to that authoritatively.
All right. So if you look at the types of numbers that were going into the Quesnel, it's clearly a much higher number.
That's right. Yes.
And if I suggest to you that we were not planning to have that kind of escapement go into Quesnel, and that was a result of decisions that around co-migrations with the lates, is that something that rings true to you?
Yeah. Yes, it does.
And in fact, that reflects perhaps the result of having to take quite a bit of care with the late runs, and we had a abundant return into Quesnel, and that those are the types of trade-offs or difficulties we're going to have when we begin to implement weak stock management. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not a manager, so I can't really speak authority to that, but my understanding is that the harvest is not controlled, but it takes weak stocks into account.
And if I also to suggest is that we're still trying to see what implications, if any, that those 2 years will have in the longer term success of production out of the Quesnel system.
Yes.
And similarly in Exhibit 810, which is the graph, if I could go to that for a moment. If I can go to the bar graph. I heard in your evidence yesterday, Mr. Hume, that the green bars are an example of perhaps a 1 year. So when we look at the Quesnel, that large green bar could in fact be the years that we just looked at, either 2001 or
It's
2002.
Probably 2001, yes.
And so in fact, the more average return would be quite a bit significantly lower than that.
Yes, it would.
And did I hear your evidence right? And this is just a clarification. I might have missed this wrong. How are the hatched bars created? Are they lake specific, or are they a generalization?
No, they're lake specific. They're based on limnological work we do on determining primary productivity of each individual lake.
Great, thank you. One final question. Yesterday we heard a number of times about the word low survival rates were used. Can we say anything about the survival rates of Fraser River sockeye salmon fry to smolt stage in terms of population dynamic perspectives, increasing or decreasing over time? I mean, I heard the word low often used, and it's a low number, but that could actually be quite a normal number. Is that correct?
Freshwater survival or freshwater survival?
Yes.
The data, the information that we have based on Quesnel and Shuswap fall fry estimates and Choco smolt estimates is a freshwater survival. So from egg deposition to smolts or fall fry has not changed. Has not changed. Basically a flat line. There's no trend lines available showing on that data set.
So they've been pretty constant for quite a few decades.
Well, constant was not the word I would use. I say there's no overall trend with time.
All right, thank you. All right, now I'm going to now turn to that more general discussion I wanted to have with Dr. Christensen and Dr. McFarlane, particularly. Obviously, Mr. Hume, if you'd like to add to it, please do, but I'm going to focus my questions there. Dr. Christensen, as an ecologist, you'll agree with me that an important part of any system, food webs, are just one part of the ecosystem approach. They're not. We've got to deal with disease, we've got to deal with parasites, we've got to deal with changing environmental conditions. It's a much broader look when we're looking at ecosystem-based management. Do you agree with me on that?
I will. The entry point for ecosystem-based management is that we are looking at an area. So that's where we start. We don't start with a food web.
So when it comes to Fraser River sockeye salmon, we've got quite a large area to deal with in an ecosystem-based management. We've got, in fact, it's arguable that we've got a number of ecosystems.
Yes, and that's very typical. We often have to be quite pragmatic about how we go about ecosystem analysis as one part of ecosystem-based management. And we may well, in this case, look differently at the freshwater, the coastal zones, and the open ocean, but it's necessary to try to integrate all of that information to get a full understanding of what happens to the Fraser River sockeye salmon.
I don't know if Dr. McFarlane, if this is a more appropriate question for you because you're a little bit closer to the management decisions than Dr. Christensen, but it's my observation, my client's observation, that it's quite a bit of a significant quantum leap or change from an individual species looking at, like an individual Fraser sockeye stock, salmon stock even, and going to ecosystem-based management. I mean, a one species approach is not an ecosystem-based approach. Would you agree with me on that?
I would agree with you on that with a number of caveats. And before we get to that, if I may, I would like to have a comment on the alternate species approach, or alternate species discussion that Dr. Christensen brought up?
Sure.
Okay. I mean, that's alternate species in diets is looked at routinely in a number of places, including on the west coast of Canada, in a number of species. And the comment on that there has been major shifts in some of the other prey species, forage species, with huge reductions is true. But there has also been, over the last 20 years, huge increases in forage species off our west coast, ranging from the most obvious one is Pacific sardine, which entered our waters in the early 1990s, and in the 2000s has been estimated to be there minimally at in the neighborhood of 300,000 to 400,000 tons, which is a huge increase in prey, considering that from 1947 to 1992 there was zero fish, not tons of fish, zero fish off our coast. So it's a highly nutritious food for many of these species, and in the diet work I've done, there has definitely been a switch of major predators, but not to salmon. The switch has been to sardine. So that was just my comment on that. Now, to get to your other question on that, focusing in on Fraser River sockeye is just a minor component of an ecosystem type management approach.
Single component, I won't say.
Single component. I would absolutely agree, and I think Dr. Christensen actually mentioned that indeed you have to look at many other factors than just that. But it is an important component if your question in that particular ecosystem management discussion that you're having with all interested parties is focusing on the Fraser River system, the Fraser River sockeye. You, for example, may not be too interested in developing a marine protected area in the northern part of the strait, if your concern is Fraser River sockeye. But the ecosystem management approach looks at many things, and having a marine protected area or whatever type of area you're looking at where you want to change up something, whether it's building or not building, log boom areas or any of those types of things, that has to be considered in those contexts. But all of them together form the ecosystem management approach.
And you'll agree with me that shift from a single species approach to a geographical multi-species is a complex shift for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
I would agree it's a complex shift for mankind. Not just the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. There's many other departments that have that build management strategies for parts of terrestrial and marine ecosystems, including the Strait of Georgia, which don't consider fisheries or fish concerns. So everybody is having a quantum leap forward in starting to consider this, and it's a good thing. I agree entirely with it.
Perhaps I'll just use your comment on everything and mankind as a stepping off place to suggest, as Commissioner Cohen has heard many times from my clients, that an ecosystem approach is not a huge shift for First Nations. It is in fact how they've looked at their territories for a long time, and it is that approach is something that will be well worth science collaborating with. Would you agree with me on that?
I would agree certainly that Fisheries and Oceans and people in other organizations, let's say in general, should collaborate with all interested parties, including First Nations, absolutely.
All right. I'd like to take you to tab 1 of our documents, and that's a report done by the Western, WWF, and I'm using this report, Commissioner, particularly for pages 12 and 13, and I'd like to take the witnesses to that because it provides a useful list, in my suggestion, for some of the strengths and weaknesses and challenges associated with ecosystem management. And I'd like you to particularly go to some of the strengths of it and just have you review those and provide any comments you might have with respect to the author's identification of some of the benefits associated with ecosystem-based management. You'll see things like improved habitat conditions. You'll see the movement from single species to multi-species approaches. You'll see the benefits of adaptive management. Those are all things that they speak about. You'll see that it gets more stakeholders involved, and if effectively carried out, it can improve cost effectiveness over a longer time period. Are those all kinds of comments that, from your own experience, you would agree with?
Yes.
And some of the weaknesses associated with it, in particular, the first one is that multi-species planning can be complex, time-consuming, and an expensive undertaking. Would you also agree with that?
The statement is so general that it's impossible to disagree.
Perhaps from a management perspective, Mr. McFarland, we're going to get into a little bit of the work you've done in the Strait of Georgia, of course, but to do ecosystem-based management, it does require a significant shift, and it's going to require some time-consuming efforts if done properly with stakeholders, and it's going to require budgets to do that. Would you agree with me on that?
I would agree with you on that, and I would also like to point out I am not a manager.
No.
My work was in science.
Yes, I appreciate that, but you'll agree with me that your work is to inform managers, be they First Nations managers or DFO managers or otherwise. You're not just doing science for science sake.
It was always my hope that it would inform managers, yes.
And that transition is still a work in progress.
Well, yeah, and that's a good thing too. I think everybody should
Yes.
progress.
Absolutely. Now, I want to take you to tab 16 of our doc. Oh, could I mark this exhibit as the next exhibit, please?
817.
Mr. Commissioner, I note it's 10 after 11. Perhaps this seems like we're moving on to something else. This might be an appropriate time.
Here we go, now recess for 15 minutes.